The movie opens in 1960 in Houston, where young George and his family move into a new home that's in dire need of repair. It doesn't even have electricity yet. One evening, their mother divides a single hamburger into 4 pieces for her children. Starving, George is eager to eat his share immediately, but his sister Mary insists they pray first. Reluctantly, George waits. After the prayer, he gulps down his piece in one bite.
I'm so hungry, I could eat this table.
Noticing her brother's lingering hunger, Mary kindly offers him half of her portion, always seeing the best in him. That night, their mother sternly tells George that he cannot afford to be held back another year in school. It would be too hard to catch up. She pleads with him to avoid fights at school. The following day at school, George is met with stares due to his appearance. In class, he attempts to answer a question, but the teacher dismisses him because of his dirty clothes, choosing instead to call on a student with shiny shoes.
Jason, take us away.
During lunch, George sits alone, devoid of food, while his classmates eat. One of them taunts him for not being able to afford even a piece of bread and begins to treat him like a dog.
How about this nasty skin? You want it? Go get it.
Enraged, George punches the boy in the face. As the teacher arrives, he runs away.
Anger was my answer to everything, and I couldn't stop myself from fighting. It was the only thing I did well.
Years later, George and a friend are loitering outside a bar when a drunk man stumbles out. They decide to follow him, planning to rob him, but soon discover the man is a police officer in a sting operation.
Surprise, boys. We're busy right here, huh?
The police arrive and chase ensues. George escapes by hiding under a house, and the police arrive with a dog. George covers himself in sewage to avoid detection. The disguise works, and the police, along with their dog, fail to find him. On his way home, George notices an advertisement for Job Corps on a TV in a store window. The ad promises free food and drinks to those who have left school. Job Corps offers vocational training to help juveniles secure employment and even pays its students. Excited, George shares the news with his mother, telling her he wants to join. She supports his decision, affirming that he has more potential than he realizes.
You want to do this job, Corps?
Yes.
Then do it right, George. Don't come running back home because you're missing me. Finish what you started this time.
A few days later, George arrives at the Job Corps in California. At the entrance, a guard outlines the rules for him. Inside, he immediately clashes with another guy, Desmond, over a bed.
It's just a bed, man.
In his duffel bag, George finds a new pair of Converse sneakers and a note from his mother. Desmond watches him with envy. George struggles during his electrical class, drawing laughter from other students. He responds with a tough look, clearly used to resolving issues with his strength. The next day, Desmond is listening to music while George tries to study. Frustrated, George unplugs the record player.
You have something against music?
Maybe I do.
Jeez, you always this pissed off?
When I'm trying to study.
Desmond, sipping from his hip flask, offers George a drink, which he declines. However, during their conversation, they begin to bond. George's mood lifts when Desmond invites him to the chow hall.
Now you're talking.
Eager to wear the new Converse from his mom, George is disappointed to find them missing. At the chow hall, Desmond advises him to report the theft after they eat. He shares with George that he's the reason there are extra brownies in the cafeteria today. Thanks to his knack for numbers, Desmond got a job in cafeteria. He tweaked the weekly order sheets, swapping out beans for more brownies.
And under my new cost-cutting plans, we got a whole lot more brownies.
And a whole lot of less gas.
George notices a guy wearing his stolen Converse sneakers. As the guy sees George's glaring look, he panics and dashes off, locking himself in his dorm room. Undeterred, George breaks down the door and nearly throws the thief out the window. Just then, Doc, hearing the commotion, intervenes and breaks up the fight. Outside, George tries to justify his actions, explaining that his mother had worked hard to buy those shoes that were stolen.
Get in the car.
In the car, Doc presents George with 2 choices. He can either send him to jail or send him home.
In the time you've been here, you punched out 3 corpsmen and 1 innocent door.
Did disrespected me.
The door too?
Offering money for a bus ticket, Doc is prepared to expel him from the program. George pleads with Doc not to kick him out.
I can't go home, Mr. Brothers. This place, it's all I have. Please.
And feeling sympathetic, Doc decides to give him another chance. He asks if George ever boxed.
Just street fights.
Talking about boxing, not fighting. It's a sport with rules.
Doc, who turns out to be a boxing coach, notices George's strength and suggests he join the boxing club.
You big enough and ugly enough. You want to learn it?
George eagerly accepts. The next day at the gym, Doc introduces George to his sparring partner. George reacts poorly to his opponent's jokes, showing aggression, but Doc reminds him that they're not here to kill each other. George enters the ring. Meanwhile, being good with numbers, Desmond offers spectators to make their bets. When the sparring begins, George tries to hit hard, but his lack of technique makes him an easy target.
Be still!
and he is quickly knocked down, drawing laughter from the onlookers. Humiliated, George storms out and punches a heavy bag so hard that it falls, silencing everyone instantly. In the locker room, Doc calms George down, explaining that 6 months earlier, his opponent was as inexperienced as George is now. Doc assures him that with proper training, he can reach the same level. Frustrated, George mentions the laughter from the other guys, but Doc insists that he must ignore the opinions of others and focus on his training. Doc begins to train George rigorously, teaching him various boxing techniques and tactics. George finds footwork and coordination challenging, but Doc emphasizes that boxing is as much about strategic thinking as it is about physical skill. One day, George calls home, and the conversation goes well until he mentions he's learning to box. His mother expresses her disapproval of fighting.
No, I'm not fighting.
What do you call it, George?
It's boxing. It's a sport with rules.
God knows I don't want you to be fighting.
God, what's God got to do with anything, Mama?
But their call is abruptly ended when George runs out of phone credit. Later, George faces the same opponent who previously knocked him down, but this time, the match is dramatically different. Within seconds, George knocks him out, leaving Doc impressed by his rapid improvement. George visits Doc in his office and learns that Doc was once a professional boxer who won his first 24 fights.
Then what?
Unfortunately, I have to trade one uniform for another.
George shows him an article about Joe Frazier from a boxing magazine and declares his ambition to become the world champion. Doc, finding his eagerness endearing, advises him to temper his expectations and explains the extensive training required before competing at a professional level. When George inquires about the next Olympics, Doc informs him that although the Olympics are next year, he won't be ready to compete for another 5 years.
5 years? I'll be an old man.
You got a punch like I've never seen. But even if you train harder than any man has ever trained, there is no way that you can make it to the Olympics next year.
The scene shifts to the following summer. George, now 19 and having trained for only 1 year, faces a more experienced Soviet boxer. Commentators doubt his chances, but his family watches proudly from home, their eyes glued to the TV. Everyone at the Job Corps rallies behind George, and even his mother, despite her reservations about the violence, joins her children in front of the television. George delivers several decisive blows, winning the gold medal effortlessly. His victory brings mixed emotions for his mother, who struggles with the violence of the sport, while George, ecstatic, hoists the American flag. His siblings watch in awe, hardly believing that their brother has won his first Olympic gold medal at such a young age. The day after his victory, George proudly wears his gold medal as he strolls through his neighborhood. He encounters a former accomplice who criticizes him for raising the American flag after his fight, contrasting it with the significant protest by other black athletes who stood with bowed heads on the podium. He accuses George of disrespecting their cause. Frustrated and hurt, George goes to his mother and vents to her, expressing his exhaustion with being labeled a sellout by those around him. She soothes him.
Let me make you something to eat. Anything you want.
I'm not hungry.
Let the Lord take me now. I never thought I'd hear that from you.
And bolstered by her support, George vows to win the championship belt to earn everyone's respect.
You gonna keep fighting? You gonna get hurt.
Didn't you watch me? They don't hurt me. I hurt them.
At the airport, George spots a stunning girl reading a sports magazine featuring him on the cover. He approaches her, and they strike up a conversation. Her name is Paula. As her flight is announced, she rushes off. George tries his best to get her number.
Your footwork is better than your pickup game, George.
She tells him to write his phone number, leaving him slightly flustered.
I'm the one supposed to be asking for yours.
George, do I look like the kind of woman that stands around by the phone?
He scribbles his number, and after she leaves, he mumbles to himself.
No, ma'am, you do not.
Back at the gym, Doc introduces George to his new team. Dick Sadler, his promoter, and Archie Moore, the former light heavyweight champion.
The morning you wake up to fight for that championship, the air tastes different. The sun looks different. And only 2 men on this whole earth matter, and you're one of them.
As George embarks on his quest for the heavyweight title, he defeats his opponents one by one, each victory bringing him closer to his goal. Under his coach's guidance, he prepares to face Joe Frazier. Meanwhile, Paula calls George, and they begin dating. She becomes a regular at his fights, supporting her boyfriend as he improves his record to 22-0. Eventually, George and Paula get married.
Do you take this woman to be your wife?
You bet I do.
After securing his 36th win, his coaches announce that he is ready for the title fight. The big day arrives in Jamaica, the title fight between George Foreman and Joe Frazier. George is the underdog, especially since Frazier defeated Muhammad Ali 2 years ago, and hardly anyone believes George stands a chance. The crowd chants fervently for Frazier. He takes a heavy left hook early in the first round but responds with powerful body shots. Frazier lands another of his signature left hooks, but just before the round ends, George delivers a massive uppercut, knocking Frazier down. The bell rings, giving Frazier crucial recovery time. Undeterred, George dominates the subsequent rounds, knocking Frazier down several times until the referee is forced to stop the fight. To everyone's astonishment, George is declared the new heavyweight champion of the world. At the after-party, George is surrounded by cheers and a flurry of journalists. Amid the excitement, a charming woman catches his eye. He also approaches Desmond, offering him a role as his financial manager, acknowledging his knack for numbers. Impressed but taken aback, Desmond agrees, promptly pouring out his drink, as George insists he stop drinking. Later, George returns to his hotel room to find that same woman on his bed. Despite his confusion, he lets her stay, and they share an intimate moment. However, the realization that he has cheated on his wife leaves George feeling deeply uncomfortable. The next morning, George watches an interview where Muhammad Ali mocks him, vowing to throw him back into the ghetto with one punch. George is infuriated by these words. A few months later, George hosts a family gathering at his luxurious mansion. He proudly shows his mother his collection of cars.
Each car has its own personality.
That's why you need 5 of them?
5. Where do you see my garage?
He's delighted to see his daughter, but his interactions with his wife are noticeably distant. Just as they're about to eat, his mother reminds everyone to thank God for the food.
God, I bought the food, Mama.
During the meal, his sister Mary announces she's expecting a baby, and Desmond shares that he's invested all George's money into rock-solid stocks.
Rock-solid stocks. I like the sound of that.
Meanwhile, Paula steps away to answer a phone call, only to discover it's one of George's mistresses on the line. She confronts George about it.
I was doing just fine before you came along.
Oh, so you don't like this life now? I give you everything.
I don't want everything. I want you.
George can't even look her in the eyes. George then travels to the Democratic Republic of Congo to fight Muhammad Ali. In this country, Ali is revered as a hero, and almost everyone supports him. At the hotel, George encounters Ali entertaining a crowd of celebrities with a stand-up routine mocking George.
Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. His hands can't hit what his eyes can't see. Now you see me, now you don't. George thinks he will, but I know he won't.
Claiming that the sports writers will regret underestimating him. When George approaches, the audience anticipates a response.
George, we was just talking about a different fighter.
But he chooses to walk away in silence, leaving Ali to continue captivating the spectators.
Well, if he boxes how he does interviews, this gonna be a short night.
I feel sorry for Ali. Foreman could put him in the morgue.
Due to Muhammad Ali's immense popularity in the country, the crowd chants the legendary phrase, Ali Bomaye, which means Ali, kill him. Despite this, commentators speculate that after Foreman's dominating performance against Frazier, Ali seems unlikely to stand a chance. As the fight begins, George takes control, landing several significant punches while Ali attempts to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Ali's continuous taunts and mockery only fuel George's anger.
That's all you got, George? They told me you was bad, George. Let me see it.
Throughout the fight, George aggressively pushes Ali against the ropes, delivering powerful punches. Ali demonstrates his defensive prowess, managing to counterattack periodically. However, George's aggressive style gradually drains his gas tank, visibly tiring him as the rounds progress, while Ali remains relatively fresh. During a break, while Dick and Archie urge George to keep up the pressure, Doc is visibly concerned by the advice, noticing George's increasing fatigue and slower movements. By the 8th round, it's clear that Foreman is exhausted, and Ali begins to dominate. He lands several forceful punches, eventually knocking Foreman down onto the canvas. Ali wins the fight by knockout, marking Foreman's first defeat. The audience erupts in admiration for their hero, Muhammad Ali. After his defeat, George reevaluates his life. Realizing that he had been blinded by his aggressive nature, he decides to make amends. He calls his wife, vowing to never leave her side again. But Paula, feeling detached and hurt, asks him to sign divorce papers instead. Seeking comfort, George visits his mother and confesses that he has dismissed Dick and Archie, blaming them for his loss. His mother supports his decision, offering him solace. Later, in an attempt to prove his strength and regain his pride, George decides to fight 5 boxers in one day. However, the rationale behind this challenge baffles everyone. Doc urges him to abandon this reckless idea before it's too late. During the event, Muhammad Ali joins the commentators.
Heavyweight champion and world-class clown Muhammad Ali about to join me at the table.
Clown? Howard, don't get hurt now.
And as the fight progresses, he captures the crowd's attention, who chant his name.
Ali! Ali!
Ali!
Frustrated and seeking redemption, George challenges Ali to a rematch, sparking an argument between them. Despite the distractions and tensions, George completes his daunting challenge, defeating all 5 fighters and knocking out 3 of them, demonstrating his enduring strength and skill. After the fight, Doc confronts George in the dressing room, questioning what he hoped to gain from fighting 5 opponents in one day.
Respect.
He advises George to return to fighting opponents one at a time. Their conversation is abruptly interrupted by a message for George. Rushing to the hospital, George learns that his pregnant sister Mary has started bleeding and was urgently hospitalized.
You tell them whatever it costs. I'll pay for it. We need the best doctors.
We already got the best doctors, George. The baby needs a miracle. We need to pray.
As doctors work to save the baby, his family begins to pray. Overwhelmed, George steps outside to pray, asking God why he would choose his sister's baby when Mary is the kindest person he knows. He pleads with God to take his life instead, if a life must be taken. The next morning, George is awakened by his mother. They go to Mary's room and find her holding a healthy baby, a miracle that doctors cannot explain.
Say hi to your nephew, Little George.
Little George?
Yeah, Mama told me you prayed. Whatever you said to him, it worked.
In the next scene, George struggles during a fight against Jimmy Young, ultimately losing by unanimous decision. In the dressing room, a coach criticizes George harshly, telling him he's lost his chance at a rematch with Muhammad Ali. Overwhelmed and suffering from heat stroke, George hears a voice.
Who said that?
Nobody said nothing, George.
Who said that?
He collapses, losing consciousness. When he wakes up, Doc informs him that they thought he was dead.
I was. Jesus Christ is alive in me. He's alive in me.
A few days later, George is baptized. Soon after, he speaks at a church, nervously telling the congregation how he found God. Spotting a girl in the audience who listens intently, he finds his calm. He declares his intention to dedicate his life to God and become a preacher, surprising and shocking Doc. Doc is skeptical of George's sudden change, suspecting it might be for show, and feels deeply upset about his decision.
Remember when you told me that you traded in one uniform for another? That's what I'm doing.
I had no say, George. My choice was made for me.
So was mine.
Next, George visits Muhammad Ali, while Ali continues to joke about him.
I come here to tell you that I found Jesus.
You found Jesus. Congratulations, George. I did not know he was lost.
George reveals that he was once so angry with Ali that he wanted to kill him, but now he's seeking forgiveness.
Come on, man. You want a rematch. I know. Just come out and say it. All you got to do is fight Kenny Norton one more time, knock him out. Then I'll give you another shot at the title, and then we both get paid, huh? Praise Jesus.
George reassures him that it's not a joke, and after a heartfelt conversation, they reconcile and eventually become friends. George then visits his ex-wife and children. He apologizes sincerely for his past behavior, hoping to make amends. During his next visit to the church, he approaches the girl he noticed before and strikes up a conversation. She finds it hard to believe that a former boxer like him could truly transform into a preacher. In response, George takes a microphone and steps outside the church to preach and inspire passersby to follow God. Although some mock him, he remains calm, showing his growth in handling anger.
But the Lord changed my life.
Was it the Lord who changed you? It was Jimmy Young. I seen him beat the hell out of you.
The girl watches from a distance, impressed by his sincerity. Later during lunch, she apologizes for doubting him, explaining that his reputation had made her skeptical. Now, seeing his true intentions, she introduces herself as Mary, and they discover a mutual attraction. George drives her to an old abandoned church, sharing his dream of buying it to establish his own congregation. 7 years later, George's dream has come true. He preaches in his own church, supported by his wife, Mary, and their children. After a service, a woman approaches him with her grandson, asking George to train the boy who has fallen in with a bad crowd.
Well, I'd sign up to train with Ali, but not the guy who lost to him.
George declines, suggesting they find guidance in the Bible instead. A week later, while playing with his kids at home, George sees a news report that the boy was arrested for committing a crime. He feels a deep regret for not agreeing to train him. George discovers an old building ideal for his plans and instructs his financial manager to purchase it. We see Desmond is still struggling with drinking problems. They renovate the space, and within a few months, the gym is thriving with students. George hires several coaches and even dedicates a section of the gym as the Muhammad Ali study hall. However, a year after opening, during a class, the electricity suddenly goes out. The power company reveals that they have not received any payments. Worse, Desmond is nowhere to be found. Frantic, George visits the bank and learns that Desmond invested all his money in high-risk stocks, which have now tanked, leaving his investment account empty.
He put them into solid stocks to set me up for life.
No, these were all high-risk gambles.
The bank threatens to repossess the property, including his mother's house. Enraged, George got the whole town looking for Desmond. Despite his anger, his mother urges him to forgive Desmond. George eventually finds Desmond in a bar, trying to escape. George catches him up and nearly kills him. Realizing what he's doing, George forgives Desmond. To salvage his financial situation, George resorts to starring in a sauce commercial and selling merchandise. Despite these efforts, his wife Mary informs him that they are still far from resolving their financial crisis. As the bank begins to seize his property, George sinks into depression. He dusts off his old boxing gear, trying to reconnect with his past as a boxer. He confides in Mary that he has asked a friend to give the upcoming sermon in his place, feeling he can't preach on living rightly when he's lost everything. He wants to fight again, and Mary is against it. She's afraid his rage can come back.
It's only two things I know how to do. That's box and preach. And preaching won't pay the bills.
George seeks out Doc, asking him to train him once more. Doc is initially resistant, reminiscing about how heartbroken he was when George quit. He explains when Joe Louis tried to come back, Marciano almost killed him in the ring.
Joe Louis tried to start at the top. The wheel started at the bottom.
You're old. They'll call us a circus act.
But not if we keep winning.
However, George manages to reassure him by telling words that his coaches once told him.
The air's gonna taste different. The sun, that's gonna look different. And only two men on this whole earth is gonna matter. And we'll be the both of them.
Hearing this, Doc's eyes immediately light up. He says George need to lose weight first, and then they can start training. Motivated, George struggles into his old gym clothes.
I think my gym clothes shrunk.
He begins training with his son.
Hey, George, take it easy, man. You're gonna have a heart attack. That's nasty, George.
He has hard time during workouts, supported unexpectedly by Mary, who helps him stick to his diet. After months of effort, George successfully makes weight and returns to Doc, ready to train fully. During a sparring session, George's speed is lacking, and he struggles to keep up with his opponent. Doc assures him they will adapt his style with new techniques. In the middle of the night, Mary wakes from a vivid dream. In the morning, she tells George that she had a dream. In the dream, the Lord spoke to her and showed her a vision of George winning the heavyweight championship again.
He's gonna lift you up in the middle of that ring, so you'll lift him up in front of millions of people.
Before his comeback fight, Doc suggests they need George's old anger to win, but George insists on approaching the fight without succumbing to his rage.
It's fight.
It's boxing. It's a sport. With rules.
George enters the ring against Steve Zowski, telling Doc that he's scared to take his robe off in front of all these people.
Last time they saw me, I looked like Superman.
So now you look like the Michelin Man. This ain't no beauty contest.
Everyone notices George is overweight. As the fight begins, George acts too calmly, even holding back his anger after getting punched after the bell. In the second round, George begins to dominate, leaving no chance for Zowski. Seeing that his opponent can't fight back, Foreman demands that the referee stop the fight.
Stop the fight! Do your job, come on.
News of George's triumphant return spreads, celebrating him as a hero to fat, old, bald guys everywhere, marking a remarkable comeback not just in boxing, but in his personal journey as well. After a remarkable streak of 24 wins, 42-year-old George Foreman faces reigning champion Evander Holyfield in a match billed as the Battle of the Ages. Despite a valiant effort, George loses by unanimous decision. Post-fight, when he visits his bank, all the employees cheer for him. Although he didn't win the match, George is stunned by a payment of $12 million from HBO for the fight. Despite the financial windfall, he tells Mary that his job isn't over yet.
Maybe I heard him wrong, George.
You heard him right. He did his part. We have to do ours.
3 years later, Michael Moorer defeats Holyfield to win the title, and now George is a contender once again. At 45, no one believes George stands a chance against the 26-year-old Moorer, a powerhouse with 30 wins by knockout and the first Southpaw heavyweight champion. Moorer's undefeated record and formidable prowess make him a daunting opponent.
How can you beat that man?
As the fight unfolds, Moorer dominates the early rounds, with George barely hanging on. Everyone at his gym, including his mother, roots for him. After the 9th round, his cornermen suggest he should throw in the towel.
9 rounds against the best in the world. There's no shame, son.
However, in the 10th round, George lands a devastating right hand, knocking Moorer to the canvas. Against all odds, George Foreman wins the title, becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in history.
Thank you.
I thank you.
We did it. We did it.
The movie then reveals that at 45 years old, George regained the heavyweight title after losing it 20 years before. George and Muhammad Ali became great friends, speaking by phone almost every day for the rest of Ali's life. In 1998, Charles "Doc" Broaddus was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame. Today, George continues to preach at his church and run his youth center in Houston.